He's the greatest actor who ever lived, but he didn't like actors. That how many in Hollywood describe Marlon Brando. A man who revolutionized cinema with a whisper, who breathed life into characters by destroying the line between performance and reality. But behind the genius was a sharp tongue, a defiant soul, and a deep disdain for what he saw as phoniness in his profession. He didn't just dislike bad acting, he hated it openly, loudly, and sometimes personally. For Brando, acting wasn't about fame or money, it was about truth. So, when he met actors he believed were frauds, egotists, or lazy, he made sure the world knew. From full-blown feuds to cold silences on set, Brando's clashes with fellow stars left scars that never fully healed. These are the top 5 actors Marlon Brando hated the most, not out of envy or rivalry, but because he believed they stood against everything he valued in his craft. And in each story, there is more than just a feud. There is a revelation about the man behind the legend. In 1955, Guys and Dolls brought together 2 giants, Frank Sinatra, the ultimate showman, and Marlon Brando, the actor's actor. It should have been cinematic gold, but instead it became a battleground. Brando, trained in the method, slow, emotional, immersed, wanted to become his character. Sinatra, quick, instinctive, and already a superstar, had no patience for Brando's endless takes and moody silences. He mocked Brando's style, calling him mumbles for his quiet delivery, and ridiculed what he saw as self-indulgent nonsense. Brando never one to avoid. A fighter hit back with biting humor. If Sinatra ever gets to heaven, he once quipped, he'll complain to God about his baldness. But it wasn't just insults. Sinatra wanted Brando's role. He thought Sky Masterson was his by right. He was the singer, the ladies' man, the icon. Instead, he got the supporting role of Nathan Detroit. That bruised ego never healed. Their scenes were filled with icy glares and tension that simmered just below the surface. What should have been friendly banter came off as barely concealed contempt. Years later, critics would still mention that feud when talking about Brando or Sinatra, because it wasn't just a disagreement, it was a war of philosophies. Method versus instinct, truth versus performance. And in Brando's eyes, Sinatra was everything wrong with acting. In the early 1970s, The Godfather was gearing up to become a defining film of its era. Brando had signed on, and then came the rumor. Burt Reynolds might be cast as Michael Corleone. For Brando, that was a deal-breaker. He threatened to walk off the film. If he's in it, I'm out, Brando warned. And it wasn't because Reynolds was talentless, it was because Brando saw in him the one thing he despised: hollow celebrity. To Brando, Reynolds was all swagger, all looks, no soul. He allegedly called Reynolds the epitome of everything that is disgusting about the thespian. Not just an insult, an indictment. Reynolds represented what Brando feared was becoming the norm. Actors who cared more about being famous than being true. While Reynolds made audiences laugh and cheer, Brando stared deeper and saw only a mask. He accused Reynolds of worshipping at the temple of his own narcissism. The studio, thankfully, chose Al Pacino, someone Brando deeply respected. But the feud with Reynolds never cooled. They never worked together, never reconciled. Reynolds once joked, "Brando hated my guts." He was right. Brando didn't just dislike Reynolds. He saw him as the death of serious acting. When Superman began filming in 1978, Christopher Reeve was a newcomer. Eager, disciplined, full of admiration for the role and its legacy. Then he met Marlon Brando. Brando played Jor-El, Superman's father. He was on set for only a few days, got paid millions, and refused to memorize his lines. Instead, he had cue cards taped to props, costumes, even other actors. Reeve, who had trained for months, saw this as an insult. Not just to him, but to the film, the fans, the character. Reeve had grown up admiring Brando, but admiration turned into disappointment. In later interviews, Reeve was brutally honest. "I don't worship at the altar of Marlon Brando," he said, "because I feel that he's a man who could have been a great teacher, but he chose not to. And that's his choice." For Brando, acting was sacred. But by the late 70s, he'd grown tired, disillusioned, and distant. Reeve saw laziness. Brando saw survival. The divide was generational. One man was just starting his journey. The other was already burned by the system. And what might have been a passing clash became something more painful, a broken moment between two artists who never saw eye to eye. In On the Waterfront, Brando gave one of the most powerful performances in cinema history. The taxi scene, "I could have been a contender," became legendary. But behind that moment was tension. Rod Steiger, Brando's co-star and fellow method actor, was frustrated. Steiger came to set prepared, focused, emotionally ready. Brando was electric, but unpredictable. He'd change lines, shift tone, move differently in every take. Steiger was constantly adjusting, trying to stay in sync with Brando's raw energy. He later admitted that Brando's genius came with chaos and consequences, and then came the moment that stung most. Brando left the set before filming Stigeresque. That meant Steiger had to perform to a stand-in, alone, without Brando's energy to feed off. For a method actor, that's betrayal. Years later, Steiger still spoke of Brando with respect, but also Payne admired the legend, but resented the man. And in that taxi cab, where Terry and Charlie confronted the past, the real confrontation, the one between Brando and Steiger, was never fully resolved. Apocalypse Now was already a film on the edge of madness, and when Marlon Brando arrived on set, overweight, unprepared, and unwilling to follow the script, the tension exploded. Dennis Hopper, who played the wild-eyed photojournalist, was already known for his erratic behavior and drug use. But he wanted to work. He wanted to connect. Brando wanted isolation. Brando refused to rehearse, refused to read lines, demanded to film in shadows to hide his appearance, and most damning of all, refused to do scenes with Hopper. The two men were incompatible forces. Hopper thrived in chaos. Brando demanded control. Director Francis Ford Coppola had to shoot them separately. Body doubles, creative editing, all because Brando hated Hopper. In Hopper's own words, what could have been a powerful on-screen dynamic became a patchwork of forced distance. Ironically, that disconnect helped the film. Hopper's manic obsession with Colonel Kurtz mirrored real life, a man in awe of someone who wouldn't even speak to him. The disconnect became the performance. But off-screen, there was no admiration, no reconciliation, just silence, distance, and the memory of two brilliant but incompatible minds colliding under the pressure of art and ego.